Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. And I've got something that's just perfect for the spooky season that we're in right now. I'll be doing a new episode of Utterly Pointless Comparisons that takes a look at a terrifying game about two boys who have someone dear to them kidnapped, and then go through the body horror of having themselves transformed into awful dinosaurs that have to make their way through 100 levels of mayhem while they... Hold on. Blow bubbles at enemies. Well, no, that of course is the story of Bubble Bobble. The game I'll be looking at today will be the arcade and SuperGrafx ports of Ghouls' Ghosts. I've already done a full comparison of the arcade versus Genesis version of Ghouls' Ghosts, which you can find linked at the end of this video, down below in the description, and also probably up here somewhere. So here's a look at the specs of the arcade and home hardware, while I tell you just a smidge about the game itself. Capcom released Dai Makaimura into the arcades in Japan in 1988, while later that year in America, and we saw it as Ghouls' Ghosts here. Also later that same year, Sega got the rights to port the game to their Mega Drive system themselves in Japan, so they released a version on a 5 megabit cartridge in Japan in 1988 that was an excellent showpiece for the system and garnered an awful lot of praise. A year later, in 1989, NEC, who had obviously taken note of all the praise heaped on the Sega version, decided that, hey, we should put a version of Ghouls' Ghosts on our brand new system, the SuperGrafx. So, that's just what they did. They provided an 8 megabit hue card at the time, and put it on their system, which was a little more than a PC Engine with another PC Engine duct taped to it. And I know that's a variation of the tired old joke about the Wii being two GameCubes duct taped together, but in this case it's a lot more accurate, as I mentioned in my PC Engine video. Because you see, all the SuperGrafx actually is a PC Engine with quadruple the RAM, and then an extra video chip that's pretty much identical to the first one, which gives it an extra background layer and an extra 64 sprites to play around with. The problem with the system was that it still used the exact same aging sound chip at that point, and it also used the same 8-bit CPU to power the whole thing, and that really was not an ideal situation to drive the type of graphics that they needed to have a true next-generation system. Now, despite all that, the SuperGrafx port of Ghouls' Ghosts was often regarded as perfect back in the day, but was it? And the answer is absolutely not. Now, I'm not going to sit here and trash this game for the next 15 minutes while I run through it. This is a good port of the game. It's absolutely worth playing and taking a look at. But it's not the perfect port that it was often purported to be back when the game was new, or in many of the years that have followed since then. So as I play it, you'll see that there's a lot of differences. The SuperGrafx version is still missing an awful lot of unique tiles from the arcade game, the detail level is a lot lower on many things, the resolution itself is considerably lower, and then you'll see there's a lot of instances where the music is just really grating and hard to listen to. Despite these shortcomings, like I said, still a very good game, still worth playing. So how close is it actually to the arcade version? Well, that's what we're going to find out here. Alright, so recording methodology for this one. I use save states and a whole lot of them. Not because I find the game difficult, I don't anymore. I've been playing this often for many years at this point. But I wanted to really try and sync the gameplay up as closely as possible between these two versions, so we'd have the same thing going on, on each side of the screen. So I start at the very end of Loop 1. We'll see the ending cutscene, and then we'll see the game start right after that. I'll show you the arcade version first so we can listen to its music, and then the SuperGrafx version right after so we can hear its music. And ironically, that's probably the best sounding song in the entire SuperGrafx version, so it's going to be downhill from there. At first you're going to say, hey, that doesn't sound so bad, and it doesn't, but it will. And then when that's all done, I'm going to show you a much briefer comparison, if you stick around, of the SuperGrafx and Genesis versions of the game. So I'll show you little bits and pieces of every level, but I'm not going to show the entire game again. So probably about 7 minutes worth. Alright, let's get on with it. I begin with a sound comparison. Here's the end of Loop 1 of the arcade game. Let's listen to the music here for just a few seconds. It sounds pretty nice, especially the pipe organs. Not sure about that weedy little flute, though. Here's the SuperGrafx version. You might hear this and think, hey, this sounds pretty good, what were you talking about the music earlier? But wait till the flute part comes in. Yeah, and like I said, this is one of the best sounding songs in this entire version of the game. It's going to be all downhill from here as far as music is concerned. Okay, here we go with the game proper. The SuperGrafx version is completely missing the fence and barbed wire in the arcade version on the left side of the screen. As you can see, the arcade version has considerably more detail in both the foreground and background layers, and color is noticeably different between the two games. The grass tiles on the ground in the arcade look much nicer and are a very different color. Still, overall, on the SuperGrafx, things look pretty nice, and it has a much larger variety of tiles than the Genesis version that we looked at last time. Let me flip over to the SuperGrafx soundtrack so you can hear a much worse version of the Level 1 music. Now in this section we can see the guillotines are a bit less detailed than the SuperGrafx port. Also on the SuperGrafx your life counter is up more on the screen, probably made to account for the overscan problem on some older TVs. Okay, the famous storm area. It looks pretty different between these two games. The arcade version has nicely animated trees in the foreground and background. On the SuperGrafx, the trees just kind of lean in a super awkward way. It's also missing the heaviest part of the rainstorm. Then once we move on to the area with the roots, we can see the colors and tiles look very different again between these two games. But also, the SuperGrafx has way more detail and much more tile variety in this section here than we see in the Genesis port, and we'll take a look at that later. I personally find the smallest of the tree faces here kind of hilarious and dumb looking in the NEC port of the game. And oh, the little caves or holes in the wall or whatever they are very round in the arcade version and sort of this weird trapezoid type shape in the SuperGrafx version. And the posts with the nooses hanging off of them, they cast a shadow in the arcade game onto the ground behind them. In the SuperGrafx version, that's totally missing. And on to the first boss fight. The NEC port retains him starting as a statue and then coming to life, which is very nice. The background is pretty nice on the SG here also, even if it looks a bit too angular and too tiled compared to the arcade game. The trees on the SuperGrafx are also way less detailed than the arcade original. Level 2 begins with an area that I feel looks pretty rough on the SuperGrafx. Parts of the foreground and background look a little more accurate than the Genesis port, but they are much lower detail than the arcade original and have way less color. The quality of the color in most of this background looks more like what I'd expect out of an NES game, frankly. In the quicksand area here, the SuperGrafx port is missing the cave ceiling. As I reach the end of this section, the wall is much more detailed in the arcade game. And again, the background parallax layer looks incredibly simple and NES-like on SuperGrafx, but the foreground layer looks mostly okay. Almost all the shading on the skull piles on the arcade game is missing in the NEC port. It's also missing the animal or monster skeletons in the foreground. This is another level where I feel that the music comes across pretty poorly in the SuperGrafx version. The earthquake area foreground is pretty similar between the two titles. Now the fire area that makes up the last part of this level, in the arcade we get nice fire animation in both the foreground and background. However, on the SuperGrafx, they just use simple color cycling instead, which is also how Sega tackled this area in the Genesis port. I'll also mention that once again the background layer is very simplified on the SuperGrafx. Another thing I'll point out here real quick is your magic meter. In the arcade game, the points that it fills out start out small and get larger as it gets closer to your weapon. In the SuperGrafx, they're all a uniform size for some reason. Alright, Boss Fight 2. Again, NEC has included the boss intro, which is spiffy. No one says spiffy anymore. Well, I just brought it back. How spiffy of me, right? Whoa, for level 3, man did NEC make a major boo-boo on this level. At least I hope it was a mistake. They messed up the parallax layer big time. The lighter bricks are supposed to be in the foreground layer, and the bluer ones in the parallax background. NEC stuck both of those walls in the background layer, making this area look way off in this version. It's one of those things where you notice something is wrong almost immediately, but might not be able to put your finger on it. But I just put your finger on it for you. You're welcome. As the elevator rises, we notice that the background hangs around a little too long in the NEC port. It fades out faster in the arcade game. And hey look, they both do a plain black background pretty well. Isn't that amazing? Alright, the tongue statues. The color is way off on the SuperGrafx in this area, at least at the start. It's also missing some details like the claws in the walls. It also introduces the parallax layer a lot sooner than the arcade game for some reason. Also notice on SuperGrafx, random pieces of the ground are just colored strangely for no apparent reason at all. And now we're up to Boss 3. Here we see quite a bit of flicker on this boss in the NEC port. Also, the foreground looks a lot more simplified and the wrong color on the SuperGrafx. Although I have to admit, I like the parallax layer better on the SuperGrafx here than I do in the arcade version. It just looks a little nicer. Good job, NEC. Level 4 looks pretty similar between the two versions of the game. The arcade version once more clearly has more detail in both layers here, but the SuperGrafx version looks pretty close. As we move into the second part of the area, again, NEC did a good job. It's very close. This is probably the most accurate looking level in the entire game. I'll take this time to point out that when you clone yourself using the dagger magic, in the arcade version it mimics the gold armor Arthur, while in the SuperGrafx version you look like the regular silver armor Arthur. This is something that Sega did in their port also. Once we get to the area with the flowing water or snow or whatever that stuff's supposed to be, things take a minor turn for the worst. NEC got super lazy with the foreground for some reason, throwing just a few straight shaded colors beneath the flowing whatever it is. In the arcade we get a nice complex dithering pattern. I usually hate dithering, but it looks good in this case. Well, at least NEC included the background layer that was omitted from the Genesis port. As we reach the sinking plant platforms, we once again see a big difference in the level of detail between the two games. There's also quite a bit of flicker here in the SuperGrafx version. Here we are at Boss 4. It would have been kinda hard to screw this one up since it's really just animating hearts. And, well, they didn't. At least not too much. There's noticeable slowdown on this part. And also when you get to the right side of the worm thing, when you're too far to the right, it sometimes prevents you from hitting the second heart from the end on the SuperGrafx, something you can easily reach in both the arcade and Genesis versions. And yeah, that thing I just mentioned about it being tough to hit that second to last heart in the SuperGrafx version, well, you're seeing it in action. Okay, last level. It's visually one of the simplest levels in the game. The color is a bit more muted on the SuperGrafx version. Other than that, it has pretty much all the important details from the arcade game, including several things that are missing from the Genesis port. So this part with all the red Arimers, I don't know, however you pronounce that, with all the annoying flying demon guys, looks pretty close in both versions of the game. And I said muted palette before in the SuperGrafx version, and now that I think about it, I probably didn't quite use the right term for that. It's really more loud than muted for the background. They made it too bright, and we're going to see that towards the end of the level, they really made it too bright. But at least for this section now, it looks pretty close. One thing that's kind of different is the tops of the platforms have a lot more depth in the arcade version than the SuperGrafx version if you look at them closely. So nothing too fancy here in either version, so not all that surprising that they got it right. And here I am heading toward the endgame area. And I'm sorry, I picked up the Psycho Cannon at different parts of this level in the two games, so just how it went. I'll point out once again that the music in the SuperGrafx port is not so great in this level and is very disappointing overall. But rather than continuing to beat that dead horse, let's move on to the next area of this little mini boss rush. One dumb little thing I'll point out here is that the fence in the background of the arcade version is more blue and bright, while in the SuperGrafx port, it's sort of a purplish gray and a lot darker, and it also has less detail. Now on the SuperGrafx here, you can't move on unless you kill both Mephistos. It locks the screen scrolling until you kill them both. Neither the arcade nor the Genesis versions do that. There's also noticeably more flicker on the SuperGrafx in this part. And oh my god, why did they make the background so disturbingly bright on the SuperGrafx here? The seams in the tiles are also very visible on SuperGrafx. NEC kinda dropped the ball on that one. Speaking of seams, or in this case, the lack thereof, the background layer kind of seamlessly transitions into the boss room in the arcade version here. On the NEC port, there's just a straight line where the boss room begins and the pattern changes. Our boss here looks pretty close in both versions. I do still prefer his unique design in the Genesis port though. And now we're up to Lucifer or Loki, whichever version you prefer, and he looks very similar too, though his head's a little weird on the SuperGrafx. After we easily take him out and get to the ending, we see, whoops, wrong floor color, NEC! Now the SuperGrafx kind of rushes through this first part of the ending. Why is that? Well, remember before I mentioned that there were certain areas I edited some black screens out of on the SuperGrafx when it had long transitions from one thing to another? Well, that happens here. It happens between each enemy that it shows, and then between each, boss that it shows afterwards. So I had to cut all those things to keep the timing closer between the two games. Now remember, don't go away. I'm going to show you a comparison of the SuperGrafx versus Genesis version right after this, but it's going to be a briefer one where I'll just show you little clips of each level instead of the entire game, since I don't think any of you probably feel like sitting through that again right now. So before I get to that, let me say a few things about the SuperGrafx version specifically. It's definitely still a very good port of the game that gets a lot of things right. But there are also some things that it gets pretty wrong. So the sound is a huge downgrade from the other versions. The forced no diagonals rule that can cause your character to just stop accidentally when you're running around and jumping is super annoying. And the controls are also noticeably less responsive than the Genesis port. So it's still a great port of the game, but as I mentioned earlier, it's far from perfect. Visually, it's a lot nicer than the Sega port that came out the year earlier on a smaller cartridge, which frankly was to be expected at that point. Alright, we've still got about 2 minutes or so to kill here, so let's talk about the ending itself as we're watching it. As things go along and we see each enemy and each level of the game represented, aside from the aforementioned loading time in the SuperGrafx or transition time, it also doesn't use the same effect to shrink the screen to have black around it that encloses it as it shows each enemy name. It only does that on the left and the right side, instead of also doing it on the bottom like the arcade game. I wish I had some kind of explanation for this change. I really don't. except that it must have just been a little too intensive to do it, or they would have. Well, because it seems like an odd thing to just omit otherwise. I guess I'll also point out here that Ghouls' Ghosts is one of only 2 arcade games ported to the entire system. As such, it's easily the best arcade game ported to the system. The other one is 1941 Counterattack, another Capcom game, which isn't bad on here, but it's not quite as accurate in most ways as this port of Ghouls' Ghosts is. You might also be wondering, hey, didn't they port Darius Plus to this? Well, Darius Plus is a special game because it works differently when you insert the same hue card in either a standard PC Engine or SuperGrafx. The SuperGrafx offered some very small enhancements over playing the game on a standard PC Engine. For the rest of its library, we only had Aldines, Battle Ace, and Mado King Grenzort. Not exactly a super great lineup, but not the worst lineup of any system that only had a few games, I'll definitely give it that. Most of these games are at least pretty playable. It's just too bad that there's only 5 of them. Famously, the SuperGrafx was supposed to also get a port of Strider, but this ended up going to the PC Engine arcade card CD format. And hey, what do you know, I already did a comparison of that game versus the arcade one, which I will link down below. Alright, that's enough stalling. Let's get ready to move along to the SuperGrafx versus the Genesis port of Ghouls' Ghosts. So some quick things to point out here. The Genesis version is actually more detailed than the SuperGrafx version in a few parts. Look at the cross in the background in the 2 games. And also, there's a higher level of contrast between the grass and the ground on the Genesis that's a little truer to the arcade game. We'll see pretty soon, though, that the SuperGrafx version has much more of the arcade game's unique tiles, even though it's still missing a lot of them. So here's something funny. Aside from the color being off in the Genesis version and it missing some tiles, I bet you never noticed how terrible the skulls look on the guillotines. Check them out. They're barely 2 colors. Here's a look at the storm area between the 2 games, and it's very different. The background layer on the Genesis doesn't feature any animated trees at all during the windstorm. Seems like a strange thing to have not included, but remember this was one of Sega's first 16-bit home titles. The Genesis version does have a full-screen rain effect that was cut out of the SuperGrafx version though. And this part, yeah, the SuperGrafx has much more detail and looks much closer to the arcade game. Absolutely no argument there. Let's skip to the boss. He's missing his statue intro on the Genesis, and the Genesis background is very simplified compared to the SuperGrafx and arcade versions. Alright, level 2. The foreground is nicer on the SuperGrafx, but the buildings have much more color in the Genesis port. The general design is a little closer to the arcade on the SuperGrafx, but I feel the Genesis version looks mostly better here, especially the background layer, despite its weird raster problem. Okay, in this section, yeah, they cut out the dilapidated building on the Genesis version. It definitely looks too blank. The skulls have noticeably more shading on the Genesis though. But, and again, the sludge under them looks a little worse. And we're missing the little gas jets on Genesis. So this area is mostly a win for the SuperGrafx. For the fire area here, we can see NEC kind of decided to use the same color cycling trick that Sega had used in their version of the game from the prior year. Now let's skip ahead to level 3. The Genesis gets the foreground and background layers here much more correct than they are in the SuperGrafx version. I still can't quite get used to the weird scrolling in the SuperGrafx one where some of the bricks are on the wrong layer. In the statue area here, the tongues look way different, and the Genesis version is missing all of the parallax for some reason. Once again, I would just like to point out that I'm not really sure why they went with such weird colors in the SuperGrafx version for this part, and that they shift the colors after the first few statues. Strange. As we get to the boss section here, man is it much plainer on Genesis. It's missing the clouds, the mountains, and the background layer. The SuperGrafx port looks way better on this part, no question. Let's skip to halfway through level 4. Yeah, this is the part missing the famous background layer on Genesis. Why, Sega, why? At least the foreground layer looks noticeably better on Genesis. Alright, final level. The Genesis is missing the stained glass here in this version. Nothing too terribly exciting here, but I will also point out that the depth of the floor tiles in the Genesis version is a little more accurate to the arcade game. And here, Sega cut the whole background out, and there wasn't even any parallax. Why did they do that? Don't know. Great question. And yeah, Sega decided to go with a plain black background here. They also don't quite have the nice rounded arch that we see in the SuperGrafx version either. On the Genesis, we're missing some background details in this section, but the color is much better. There's also less flicker on the Genesis in this area. Okay, the Bee Thing boss. I always liked it better on the Genesis than the arcade version, so it should surprise no one to find out that I prefer the Bee Boss on the Genesis version to the SuperGrafx version as well, even though the SuperGrafx version is more accurate to the arcade game. Now, Lucifer/Loki is about the same in both versions except for his kind of weird head on the SuperGrafx. And hey look, the floor is the right color in the ending on the Genesis. That automatically makes this the best version, right? Relax. I'm kidding. Anywho, I'm not going to make you sit through that whole big long ending again, so I'm going to cut it short in just a few more seconds here, and then I'll finish up the video. Alright, so there we go. There's a full one-loop comparison of the arcade and SuperGrafx versions of the game, and a shorter comparison of the SuperGrafx and Genesis versions of the game. So what are my final thoughts after going through all three of these? Well, the SuperGrafx port is a good game. It's a really good port. They did a lot of stuff right in this version. It's good to see a lot of things that were visually cut from the Genesis represented in the SuperGrafx port. But, on the other hand, the sound is a gigantic downgrade from both the arcade and Genesis versions, and the gameplay doesn't quite measure up to the speedy, responsive Genesis version either. So in the end, if we're going purely by visuals and talking about only the two home ports we looked at here, the SuperGrafx version is probably on top. It's still less detailed than the arcade in a lot of places, but it's good. It looks better than the Genesis version overall. When it comes to sound, no question, the Genesis version is the best of the two. As I said in my comparison to that video, I actually prefer most of the music in the Genesis port to the arcade original. Now when it comes to gameplay, I easily give this to the Genesis as the top in all three versions. I prefer it to the arcade game again because it feels faster, the controls are more responsive, and we don't have any of the silly diagonal BS that we have to deal with in the other ports. And you can turn that diagonal BS on from the regular non-hidden menu in the Genesis version if you want to, but why would you want to? So that's what I think about all these games. What about you? What do you think? Which version of Ghouls 'n Ghosts is your favorite and why? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. That'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please toss it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. And also, if you have the urge, you can support the work I do here on either Patreon or Ko-fi. The links will follow at the end of the video, and they're also down in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.